Uh, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for those kind remarks. Congresswoman Waters and Congressman McGovern, thank you for the honor, really, to appear before you today and to talk about Syria. Uh, First thing I'd like to say is that it was a huge honor for me to represent the United States in Damascus. We had a really strong policy in respect to the demands for change in Syria. Last May, President Obama laid out a very clear policy guidance to those of us working in the Middle East. The president said that America would stand more for the respect of the dignity of the simple citizen in Arab countries, the street vendor, as he put it, and not just with powerful dictators. The president stressed that we would support respect for universal human rights, such as freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. President Obama emphasized that we would support and seek to promote political reform and the establishment of governments that meet the legitimate aspirations of their peoples. Last November, Secretary Clinton, then speaking specifically about Syria, highlighted that supporting democratic transitions in countries like Syria is in our national security interest, and she also stressed that the desire for dignity and self-determination is a universal desire, and that when freedom gains ground in any country, Americans themselves are inspired. And so with that policy guidance, in Syria, we have pushed very hard for the support of respect of universal human rights and the desire for freedom. The United States has long called on the Syrian regime to comply with international human rights standards and treaties. Let me underline here that the Syrian government in 1948 signed the United Nations Universal Charter on Human Rights. The Syrian government is legally obligated to respect those universal human rights. I raised human rights issues continually during my tenure in Damascus, starting with my first meeting 13 months ago with President Bashar al-Assad. I have to tell you that in that discussion, Assad showed little interest in human rights. In fact, he was rather annoyed that I raised it. And his callous disregard over the past year has degenerated into massive human rights violations that may amount to crimes against humanity. In the past year, the human rights situation there has become much worse. We will issue in a couple of weeks the annual review of the situation of human rights in Syria and other countries, and I would encourage the committee to look at that report once we issue it in a couple of weeks. As Congresswoman Waters mentioned, estimates of the numbers of dead now range 8,000. There are some estimates of 10,000. Several international institutions and non-government organizations have done thorough research of the human rights abuses in Syria. And I would highlight here the work of the United Nations Human Rights Council's Independent Commission of Inquiry, which has also issued a report, and a very detailed report that specifically assigns responsibility for some of the abuses. Beyond the brutal killings of peaceful demonstrators, places like Dara, as the chairman mentioned, the worst human rights violations occur in detention facilities, where dozens of methods of torture have been documented by observers and researchers. This United Nations Human Rights Commission of Inquiry that I mentioned had numerous testimonies from detainees and former detainees of the kinds of torture applied against detainees, including even children. And you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, the case of Hamza al-Khatib, which is only one of many, many examples. I have to say, contacts of ours at the embassy in Syria, people that I and my staff knew personally, told us about horrible experiences that they had had. It was just atrocious. Syrian security forces, even today, are still entering restive neighborhoods and towns and cities, for example, Homs and some of the suburbs of Damascus, Idlib, Tara. They are arbitrarily detaining people, especially men, usually between the ages of 16 and 45, but even sometimes women and children. The men, particularly, are often subjected to torture, abuse, and humiliation. So let me say here that the United States strongly supports accountability for the crimes committed by the Syrian regime. Beyond the need for justice, we believe that the collection of evidence and the calls for accountability from the international community will convince more regime force commanders and members of those security forces to resist orders to commit human rights violations and ultimately abandon their loyalty to the regime. So I have a message here now for the officers and commanders of the Syrian security forces. The world is watching. This is not like Hama, when the father of Bashar instituted a security operation that killed tens of thousands in 1982. This is not 1982. And those commanders, those members of the security forces, should understand that we are watching and we are going to support collection of evidence. I'd like to add another point, if I may, Mr. Chairman. President al-Assad seems to think that he can kill, that he can arrest thousands of people, he can repress a generally peaceful protest movement and survive, and that the world eventually will forget, and that the world eventually will open its doors to him again. But as I said, this is not 1982 again. This time the evidence of atrocities, the videos, the TV coverage, the stories from journalists, you mentioned Anthony Shadid, Marie Colvin, there are French reporters, Mr. Ucherlik, who was killed, and others, and the refugees, thousands of refugees, who have given their stories. This time, unlike Hama, we have a very detailed picture of what has happened. This time, the world will not forget. Assad and his family that are running Syria have lost their legitimacy. They must step aside and let a democratic transition go forward. During the post-Assad transition that we are working for, a focus on accountability along with reconciliation, accountability and reconciliation, will help the new Syrian government build its credibility and foster long-term stability. If I may, Mr. Chairman, let me just mention broadly what we are doing in response to the horrible human rights situation in Syria. First, we are ratcheting up pressure on the regime and we are striving to isolate it. I would highlight here several things. The United Nations General Assembly voted 137 countries from all continents for a resolution denouncing the Syrian government's actions and calling on the Syrian government to accept the Arab League's proposals for a democratic transition. 137 countries voted for it. Only 12, including Russia and China, voted against it. We have also implemented a series of very tough economic sanctions, ranging from preventing transactions, outlawing transactions with the Central Bank of Syria, outlawing import of oil. We have convinced our partners to take steps like this too, and the Syrian government's budget revenues are plunging. The Syrian petroleum minister said the regime was losing more than $2 billion a year in lost revenue because of those sanctions. Secretary Clinton on April 1st will be in Istanbul to attend the next meeting of the Friends of Syria group. This group was put together again to reinforce the isolation of the Syrian government, and representatives from, again, all continents will be there at that meeting. Second track that we're working on, Mr. Chairman, is to provide emergency relief to the Syrian people who are suffering so much. We have so far provided over $15 million in humanitarian assistance. Congresswoman Waters detailed that assistance, and I won't go through it here. And I would just emphasize also we were pleased with the decision, the Homeland Security, to grant temporary protective status. I remember Senator Casey explained to me the story of one tragic Syrian man who visited his brother here and then went back to Syria last August and was killed. We don't need more stories like that. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to conclude by just saying we are supporting the efforts to create a democratic transition working with the Syrian opposition. We support citizens in and out of Syria who have begun planning for a democratic transition, from leaders of the Syrian National Council, I believe you're going to hear one in the second panel, but also working with local coordination committees inside Syria and local revolution councils inside Syria. And I would just commend the work that they are doing in incredibly dangerous and difficult circumstances. We continue to urge the full range of opposition groups and individuals in Syria, including representatives from all, I want to underline that, all ethnic and religious minorities, to come together around a unified vision for a peaceful and orderly transition. I don't want to speculate about what might be warranted in the future, but I do want to underline we do not believe now that further militarization of the situation in Syria is the best course forward. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I'll stop there, and I'd be delighted to take questions or discuss any of these points.